All right. Hello, MetaDreamer. Welcome. Thank you for taking the time to be on this. Could you please introduce yourself and what you do?
Yeah, for sure. Thanks, Sarah. I'm MetaDreamer. I'm a designer and software engineer. I've been working in the Web3 crypto space for uh how long has it been? Almost like 5.5, 6 years now. Like I mentioned earlier, I'm Muslim Canadian, born in Canada. My parents are from Pakistan. Um, born mid 90s, kind of grew up in the uh, you know, post 9/11 era. So yeah, that's kind of my background and context.
Well, that's going to be really relevant for our conversation today. So, we talked a bit about this before we started recording, but um, I am North African. I also grew up in New York post 9/11. It is a very difficult world for people like you and me. There is a lot of discrimination that my family experienced that I was witness to. It is a pretty hostile world in a lot of places in the West. So, to preface this conversation, we're going to talk about the current situation in Israel, Palestine. Um, I want to let everybody in this listening know to refer back to your podcast that you did with Keith from Metagame. It's almost 6 hours. It's very in depth about like the actual political side of this, and I think that that's going to do a way better job than I can in this talk. So to preface this, could you please explain like why you're connected to this cause, why you decided to do so much research and go live and have this conversation?
Yeah, I mean, so uh in I've always, uh known about the Palestinian cause, but not like too deeply about it. Um, you know, and since October 7th, after that is what made me really kind of dive deeper and try to understand the truth of what's going on. And, I knew the situation was bad, but I didn't know the depths of the like how bad it was until I went and did that research. So, I've been having like a lot of conversations with like friends and family and various people to kind of, you know, uh, see how much people actually know, and just finding out like how little people know. It was pretty scary, even for me having been a Muslim, like even I had, a lot of uh, wrong misconceptions about what was going on, just from having, living in the West and just like passively absorbing, Western propaganda, in that way. And, the growing like this particularly, hits home for me because I grew up in the West as a Muslim. I was like 6 years old when 9/11 happened, and it was a pretty like strange world to live through where, you know, um, a lot of my sort of self-identity, I was, not ashamed per se, but it was like something I hid away, in terms of like my Muslim identity, and, just living in a world where everyone kind of looks at you a certain way, and treats you a certain way, or sees you and your religion in a certain way, that, has an effect on you. And, so like I was raised Muslim, but in my like teenage and like university years, I kind of fell away from it, and, wasn't really practicing. And it was only, after I met my wife in university and like watching her journey, in, becoming Muslim, that I kind of relearned what the religion was like actually about. And, it really opened my eyes to just uh, how much like institutionalized uh, propaganda and, Islamophobia there is in the West. So much so that me as a Muslim, it affected me too. And so, after that, I, got much closer to my religion, along with my wife, and have been studying like various religions and just spirituality and all this, a lot of history as well, particularly like the Abrahamic religions, in like the last like 5, 6 years. So uh, yeah, that's kind of where I've come from, and yeah, just uh, studying this like current issue, and just seeing how blatant everything is, yet how blind so many people are in the West, especially like people I know are smart and intelligent and working in tech and even especially in the crypto space, like people that say they stand for freedom and self-sovereignty and all these things, but when push comes to shove and whatever's inconvenient to say like doesn't get said. And so that's why I wanted to do that podcast with Peace and kind of it's like the least I can do. I feel like a moral obligation to use whatever voice I have to talk about this and normalize talking about it. And I think until it's normalized to talk about this, it's going to continue to get worse and worse, and there's not going to be any resolution. And the censorship around this topic is like one of the biggest barriers.
I'm going to share a part of my personal experience to relate to you and also to kind of show the world what you're talking about. I think it was a big shock to me. I recently had a conversation with my mother. Like I said, I grew up in New York in the 90s, and in 2003, that was the invasion of Iraq by the United States under the pretenses that their government had chemical weapons and weapons of mass destruction. One day I went home and I said to my parents that Iraq deserves what they're getting because they are trying to kill people. And I was a little genocidal maniac as a kid. And this is obviously not my perspective. I don't understand anything. My head is pretty empty at that point. I don't have the capacity to form any political opinions, but I am picking up on what my surroundings are giving me. And I think that is a common experience shared by many Muslim people in the United States and in the West. And I would like to also include the fact that this is probably a shared experience with many Jewish people around the world and in the United States. I think that the
Hmm.
points I want to try to get at during this conversation is find areas where we can relate with each other, because that is a great starting point for having an actual conversation. When this
Hmm.
started in October 7th, October 8th, October 9th, I was extremely angry. I had a lot of anger and resentment, and I found myself not thinking properly. I think there was a lot of like hatred that I was thinking through. I had a lot of friends who are Jewish that I refrained from reaching out to because that was the point where the retaliation started, and we would see all these videos of young kids and buildings being destroyed and all of the different, you know, gore that is available on Twitter. And I found myself not reaching out to people and asking them how they are, despite knowing that they could possibly be affected by this, despite the fact that I've spoken with them in person about this topic and that I have connected with them. And I think that is a huge danger. I think that's a danger that exists on both sides, where anger kind of takes over your rational thought. And instead of connecting, you go deeper and deeper into one position or another, and you end up justifying a lot of unjustifiable stuff. So, to start this conversation, you discussed the current happenings in Israel Palestine again on Pete's podcast. You went really deep in there. During this research that you've done, what are some things that you've picked up on and that you've noticed that a lot of people are not aware of that you could share with us?
Yeah. So just I want to touch on one point real quick too. I think like one of the greatest tragedies of this whole thing is just like how close Jews and Muslims are in both like faith and history and like religion-wise theology and everything. There probably couldn't be like two closer groups in terms of overall philosophy on life. And I think Jews themselves are probably one of the biggest victims of this whole situation, in terms of being victims of propaganda. I can't say if I was um, an Israeli born in Israel and growing up around, that education system and that society, that I would be thinking any different than they are. And so, that's like sometimes a very difficult pill to swallow. I think, there's less of an excuse for people who like aren't in Israel and they can, have more exposure to these different viewpoints and, they can end up like still holding these like very twisted viewpoints. I think that's like less excusable, but I understand why that is the case. The decades of investment in anti-Islam propaganda by the U.S. and Western powers. This is the payoff of it now, where people can so easily be desensitized to what's happening or not think much of it or be able to ignore it. I think in terms of what people don't really know about there's so much people don't really know. It's hard to say one thing, but that is one, which is like how close these religions are, and throughout history the relationship between like the Jewish and Muslim communities was always strong. And this idea that like anti-Semitism is something inherent in Islam or amongst Muslims is like very incorrect. In fact, it was the Muslims that gave refuge to the Jews who were expelled from other places or displaced by the Roman Empire, the Byzantines, and all these things. So the what I think happened is the kind of guilt of the Holocaust and World War II got transferred onto the Palestinians, and the European Zionist Jews kind of got hit with the ethno supremacy bug after spending some time in Europe with whatever Nazis or kind of ethno supremacy ideology that there was there, and brought that into the Palestine and Israel. And there was also another like thing that people don't really know about this is that the whole kind of Zionist movement is like it uses like Judaism as a religion for a lot of its justification, but most of its kind of proponents and founders were atheists. And they don't really believe in God in that way, or kind of Judaism as a religion. They wanted, like, Zionism kind of became a way to have like take the religion out of it and turn it into like an ethno group as a almost replacement for Judaism as a religion. If you look at a lot of the Zionists, they didn't early on, they actually didn't like the religious Jews, because the religious Jews, would tell them that it's wrong to, kill and murder people and take their land and do all these things. And you find that to this day, there's a lot of like Orthodox Jews that are strictly against the state of Israel. In fact, in like Judaism itself, the Jews are not allowed to establish a state before the return of the Messiah. So even in the theology of Judaism itself, the state of Israel is illegitimate in that sense. But because of kind of this 21st century, or like in the 20th century, and then moving into the 21st century, there was this kind of removal of religion from people's lives. Zionism kind of became an identity, or kind of group, a group identity that as a replacement for like religious Judaism, and to turn it into like a ethnocentric sort of movement and create a state based on that sort of mindset. So it's difficult because the Zionists really successfully co-opted the term anti-Semitism, and in all the kind of teachings and kind of propaganda that comes out of there have really even instilled in Jewish people that the identity of being a Jew and the state of Israel is inseparable. That those two, if someone wants to, if someone is like criticizing Israel, they're criticizing all of Judaism. And in this way, they've kind of used Judaism as a human shield, ironically, against all forms of criticism, against whatever, their real underlying kind of ethno-supremacist, like colonial motives are. So, a lot of people, they're afraid of, speaking out about this because they're afraid of like offending Jewish people, or, they're afraid that will be perceived as hate towards Jews. But that really just, that's only the case if you don't really know the history or know the context of it. If you look at a lot of the Holocaust survivors, they're the ones who speak out the most against what's happening in Palestine, because they were in those shoes at one point, and they can see that how the IDF treats Palestinians is not that different from how the Nazis treated Jews in the Holocaust. So it, that's, I think, a very important thing. Is like, is it going to be? It's not easy to do, but separating the state of Israel and this like ethno supremacist movement of Zionism from like the Jewish faith and the Jewish people as a whole. And I think the people contributing to anti-Semitism more than anyone else are, is the Israeli government and all the decisions they're making. If I wanted people to hate Jews, I would, bomb children in the name of Jews. That's probably like one of the most effective ways to get people to dislike a certain group of people. And a lot of my Jewish friends I've talked to, they're rightfully concerned about anti-Semitism, but sometimes it's misplaced in terms of what's seeding that and where that's coming from. And if you look at any of the work by any like reputable historian or academic, like Ilan Pappé, he's an Israeli historian, or Norman Finkelstein, Noam Chomsky, like they've written extensively about this, and they almost all of them recognize Israel as like a completely like illegitimate state and acting, completely in bad faith and against the interests of Jews as well. And so that's the biggest thing, is like really understanding the nuances here, and being able to separate like what is actually Judaism, what is Zionism, and what was Zionism, what was Zionism is now is very different too. The origin or kind of like lore of Zionism, it wasn't so bad initially, in terms of, I actually agree with Zionism in that, every kind of group of people deserves to have their own state, and, they have a right to self-sovereignty and all these things. And, but what Zionism turned into now is like, specifically, it has to be in this place, and it has to be majority, we have to expel everyone else that was there, and all these kind of additional caveats that get added onto it. So Zionism in practice and Zionism in
So
theory are very different. Yeah, go ahead.
there's a lot of things to pick here, and I think the starting point I want to go to is the idea of anti-Semitism. I lived again in North Africa in a majority Muslim country, and I've spoken to a lot of people who have differing opinions on the topic, and this was a long time ago, and that over the years, a sense of anti-Semitism has developed. And I say this really hesitantly because because I don't want people to associate that with an Arabic country or with a Muslim country, because at the end of the day, I don't think that they're hateful people. I think every time they turn on the TV, they do see, here is this building getting bombed, and here is this kid who's decapitated. And it is really difficult to consume this stuff, especially as somebody who is a parent and you see these kids and like the promise of a life that could have been that is not there. And it's easy to place that on what the world has agreed is a Jewish cause, as opposed to nation states cause. To preface what I'm going to say, I really have a lot of criticisms towards nation states in general. I am an international person. I live in Poland. I am from the United States. My father is from North Africa. I've traveled the world, and I really don't like the idea that we should be separating people based on ethnicity, based on color of skin or religion or whatever. It is an illogical idea in an age where we're all connected via computer. It just doesn't make sense anymore. I think that what is happening, and I think Israel as a country right now, its biggest challenge is the fact that it came in late to a world where there is internet. From speaking from my culture's history, uh, Algeria is a North African country. It is a Berber country. The people there are Kabylian. They are descendants of ancient Egyptians. They did not have a religion until some 1200 or something. And they still, to this day, even though they are associated with a specific religion because of the region, they are very different. They drink, they do a lot of things, and they speak different language. And over the from the 1200 onward, there was this Arabization, so an invasion basically of North Africa from Arabic countries, Saudi Arabia, and its environment. And people to this day are bitter about this. They don't like the fact that their culture has been slowly over hundreds of years erased. But the reality of most countries right now is that is their history. The United States came in 1500. It was a bunch of people from European countries coming over to continental US, kicking out the natives, slowly reducing their size of land, and bordering them, killing them, taking their everything. And now we live in these countries. You live in Canada, I lived in the US. That conversation is not relevant anymore. And I think it's going to be really difficult to get the point across of colonialism in America because of the fact that this is a bitter pill to swallow. If you mention the word colonialism, people think about their colonial history. Their ancestors did the same thing that's happening in Israel. It's just there wasn't internet. People didn't see the kinds of atrocities committed on both sides because the natives also beheaded people, killed people, hung them upside down. It's a brutal world that we live in. It's a very power driven world. And right now I think what I would like to get out of any conversation I have about this topic is to look at the current situation and think of a realistic solution. And what can we do in a personal level on the internet with the people that we're friends with? And then what can we do on a global scale to make this issue a lot less apparent? And one of the things you mentioned that I want to talk about is how similar these groups of people are. I don't think many people understand how similar the Jewish people are to the Muslim people. They really do have the same practices, the same philosophy, the same kind of out view on what the world is and what the afterlife is. They're way closer together than a Christian is to either a Muslim or a Jewish person. There is just a big social divide right now. So
Mhm.
one issue that I think can be worked on and that I'd love to see is shared spaces where a shared community where a Muslim can go and a Jewish person can go and actually have a conversation. Because I think that's the biggest de-radicalizer ever for both sides. And I think that's
Mhm.
something that countries in general, including the organization of Hamas and the IDF, are trying to prevent by separating the physical spaces. Like you could go as a Muslim to
Mhm.
a lot of these religious buildings, but you have to go through your own path. That's walled off, right?
Mhm.
Same for Jewish people. Jewish people can't go on that path. They need to go on this path. And that creates this like ever growing rift, right? Like mentally, socially.
Mhm.
Have you seen this, encountered this as a solution? Do you think this is a viable way to get people to have conversations and connect?
Yeah, so um I think I want to like hit on this point of like colonialism first in a second. Algeria has a very, recent history with this too. There's this movie called The Battle of the Algiers, which, goes over this kind of context of French colonization in Algeria and how Algeria was able to gain its independence and the resistance fighters at that time, it looks very much like Hamas looks like now, in terms of, having to resort to
They
terrorism
were called
as the only
terrorists.
means for,
They were called terrorists.
exactly, yeah. So, you know, um, same thing with like South Africa, Nelson Mandela was called a terrorist, all these things. So, um, and, I think this kind of, this kind of idea of like people coming in and replacing a culture is like becoming politically like relevant again now with like you have like the great replacement theory now where white people in Europe or America are talking about all these like immigrants coming in and gonna like replace them or like replace their culture and this and that, which you know basically I want to draw a distinction between like that and going into another country and like exterminating them like as if they were pests. That's a much worse form of colonialism or replacement than simply like immigrating and working there and becoming a part of that society, and increasingly so. And a lot of it's to do with like cultural practices as well, like in terms of families, like a lot of like uh, white Western families, they live in kind of small households with like the atomic family unit and not having a lot of kids versus a lot of immigrant families, they have much more kids, and that can have a pretty like compounding effect over multiple generations. The difference if like someone has one or two kids, how many people are in their family after three generations versus if each generation has five kids, it's very exponential. So I think again, like there's a verse in the Quran too that God says that we made you of different colors and different tribes that you may get to know each other. Not as a means of separating people or being only in our own groups, but as a means to like create contrast between each other so that we can learn about each other and appreciate each other. And in that sense, I think there's a difference between going in and killing a population versus going in and kind of integrating within a population or a certain population of people, their culture evolving over time. And you get that even generationally, right? Like the like generation above us are like, oh, the Gen Zs are, their music is trash, they're lost, they're very whatever. So even if it's not a different culture, even just like generational, there's always this kind of tribalism in a sense of like boomers versus millennials versus Gen Zs or whatever. So I think that tribalism will continue to exist, but there's a difference between that kind of tribalism versus this idea that one group is superior over all others, and another group is seen as like pests or animals that need to be exterminated to make space.
Can I
And yeah, in terms of yeah.
quickly, this is one of the things that I learned, to go off of my question from earlier. One of the things I learned that I did not know about is how many. So when the state of Israel was set up, there were these camps that they had when they would bring in Jewish people from all over the world. They need to go through these camps to learn the language, to learn to participate in the culture. A lot of it was skewed towards Western mentality. The people that set it up, obviously, Israel were more Western and had more capitalistic ideas. They were less farmers, more technologists, more industrialists. So they had these camps set up, and a massive amount of Jews are. I think it's Maharazi, or they are the. We're talking about the Jews from North Africa, Middle East, and then there's a lot of Jewish people from Uzbekistan and the surrounding region, so the Central Asian Jewish people, and they had to go through these camps and to learn how to align with a specific culture and to have certain ideas, because you need to turn them into people that are loyal to the state of Israel. That happens over generations. It's not something that someone is going to move over from Algeria, which had like 5 to 10% Jews in the 1800s, to Israel. They're still going to feel a connection towards their old culture, right? Like this is where they came from. And I think there is a massive movement towards that to understand how close these people are. They are genetically almost the same. Obviously, there's different types of Jewish people all over the world, but the majority of them are extremely close to Arabic people and to Central Asian people. And I didn't know
Yeah.
that.
Hmm. Yeah, they're, in terms of lineage, they're basically cousins to each other. Both descendants of Abraham, Muslims from Ishmael, and then Jews and Christians from Isaac. And, the again, the kind of European Jews were the Jews that, left whatever thousands of years ago from the North Africa or Middle East or wherever it is, went to Europe, and over generations, became like more European in like their genetics and whatnot. And then, you know, uh, but a lot of the narrative is like very centered around that specific group of Jews, and a lot of the other types of Jews are kind of brushed under the rug, or not, seen in the same way, or kind of like the European Jews kind of co-opted the idea of like Judaism um, for themselves in establishing Israel as this kind of ethno supremacist state.
Do you know Drew
Um,
Blinsky? He's a
and
YouTuber, a travel YouTuber who went to, I think it's Ethiopia, if I'm not mistaken. But there is a minority in that country of Black Jewish people who basically, like, he went into their community and it was really eye-opening to me. I did not know this at all. And he shows how these people live, and they basically have the Torahs that are hidden inside of trees. They go to the same types of schools that Jewish people go to learn, like similar to the mosque schools. I don't madrasas, so they have a similar system where they go to these like religious organizations and learn about their religion. And these people have a very difficult time actually immigrating into Israel, despite the law of any Jew can return to their homeland in Israel. These people have a very difficult time going through that same process, and a lot of them, their dream is to do that because they're heavily discriminated against within their own country. Um, Sorry to go on that tangent. It's super interesting to me to see how, people vary.
for sure. Yeah, and even with Muslims, it's like Muslims are probably the most diverse in terms of religion. If you look at, Indonesian Muslims, Indonesian's like the uh, biggest Muslim country in the world, and people don't even know that more Muslims in Indonesia than any other country. And the way that they practice the religion and faith, it's the same kind of core protocol, but the way that it presents itself in terms of the different culture and way they do things over there is very different. Again, with like Russian Muslims, Islam was in Russia for like 1300 plus years. Significant like population Muslims there, like Khabib Nurmagomedov being one of the most famous ones. And then, of course, like African Muslims, even in South America, Latin America, like Muslims that were there, and it's all the Western kind of media made this association of like Arab Muslims being the only type of Muslims, and that's very kind of limited and like not really factual, and but a lot of people just don't know that. And yeah, I want to go back to
Connecting the
the
ethnicity to the religion.
yeah,
Go
yeah,
back, yeah, please.
exactly.
But
Yeah, I wanted to hit on the idea of like shared spaces, and conversations and bridging that gap. Um, from what I've seen, uh, it's difficult to have like public shared spaces, in terms of even like as a Jew, even you, for example, you were saying you're not Jewish yourself, but you have Jewish friends or VCs that and things like that, and uh, that it becomes hostile to engage in something like this, where you might be seen as like a traitor, or especially if you're Jewish yourself, um, being in that kind of space, or having these kind of conversations, especially if it's like the intention is to seek towards the truth, and as the truth gets uncovered, people get, demonized for engaging with that, or and it's crazy too. I was watching this one live streamer. He was talking to an IDF soldier on his live stream, and IDF soldier was talking about how like there's a significant amount of Jews in Israel that even though they're so against what's going on, they have to like keep it a secret, and they have literally, uh, like secret meetings where they can, meet up with Muslims and discuss things and all this stuff, without a fear of getting, harassed by whatever kind of extremist Zionist Jews there might be in Israel. If you look at, for example, the families of some of the hostages, Israeli hostages, like they've been being harassed because they've been trying to call for the hostages to be released. And Israel says that that's what their goal is, but the real goal is to how do we get all the Palestinians out of here so all of this land can belong to Israel. And the hostages are a wrench in that plan. And that's why you see even from there's like all these reports now coming of how on October 7th, all the kind of burnt bodies that Israel talked about were actually because of IDF firing on hostages. So there's a thing called the Hannibal Directive in the IDF where they would prefer to kill their own soldiers and civilians rather than them become hostages, rather than them be held hostage by Hamas, because that gives like Hamas, leverage. So, that's the kind of reality of the situation there. And the IDF soldier was talking too about how, because of what's been happening, a lot of Jews been learning more about Islam in the first place. Because the way it's portrayed there, it's always like, it's such a like 180, because they don't realize just how close these two groups of people are. And the propaganda has to make them as different as possible to like justify all that oppression. And once people even find out a little bit about how close these two like religions and groups of people are, that alone is enough to kind of like flip a switch in their brain, being like, hold up, like why were they lying about all this, or why didn't they say that how similar these two things are. And significant amount of people like becoming Muslim because of that in the West too. You look at, like, it was just yesterday, I think, Sean King, converted to Islam because, when you grow up your whole life thinking one way about a group of people, and then you find out the reality and it's the polar opposite, it has like a profound effect on people. So I'm all for, I think, opening up more conversations between these groups of people. And I think the internet is the number one kind of force in like helping make that happen, and also to like help that's like stopping this, it's not stopping it, but it's like the biggest tool that we have to help against the genocide of the Palestinians, in terms of this is like the world's first like live stream genocide. In the Holocaust, you couldn't see, live feed of videos and pictures coming in of seeing what's going on. But now you can, and that's what's like especially scary, is that the fact that you can see live what's going on and still be kind of really ignorant or oblivious to it. That is, I think, very like morally unacceptable. But it's just like that's probably what like hurt me the most of all this, is that how many people are blinded to the reality there. And it's a lot of the time it's because we continue to be in our own echo chambers and not engage with other sides. But I think the internet provides opportunities for that sort of engagement and conversation. And it'll be interesting to see like if there's a like there's been like certain things like on Jubilee, I think, it's that YouTube channel where they always have like two groups of people come together to talk about things. So there is that kind of stuff, but it's not really, I think until that every like average person is able to like engage with another average person about this, it's not gonna get better. And the biggest barrier is still been like, people are just uncomfortable talking about it. You bring it up and people are just like, don't engage, or like, and or they get mad that you want to talk about it. It becomes like they start criticizing the way in which you're talking about it rather than being mad about what's actually happening. And so there's this again, this kind of idea that maybe if we like ignore it enough, it'll go away, or it'll blow over. And that's what happened in the past. That's why it's gone on for 70 plus years without any resolution. But I think this time is different because the younger generation who doesn't have as much of this kind of propaganda baggage of like growing up in the early 2000s, the all the kind of 25 and under age group of people, both on Jewish side and Muslim side, and every side, like they can see the truth of what's going on more because they have less of those blinders from decades of propaganda. And so that's what makes me hopeful for the future, is that the next generation of people is much more willing to seek the truth and be honest with themselves about what's going on.
So I am incredibly uncomfortable, and I've spoken to a lot of people in person who are also incredibly uncomfortable to have this conversation. You're right, it's not easy because there's a lot of ways that words can be used as a weapon or to guilt you. And I think that's the war doesn't only happen in the physical front. It's not just bombs.
Mhm.
It's also propaganda. It's also generations of, radicalization that happens on both sides. And this was probably one of the more fundamental parts of my life, or one of the events that really kind of grew me up a little bit. I live in Poland now, and obviously, you know what happened here. This was where the genocide against the Jews happened, or a lot of it. I went to Auschwitz with my wife, and my wife's family is Catholic Christian, and I saw things that it's all on YouTube. You could go and watch it yourself. Everybody here can. I saw things that really kind of made my stomach turn, and just the idea of how cruel we can be towards each other. And then hearing about the fact, so when the Germans came into Poland and they started taking over these country houses, one of the places is actually Hitler's hiding place, and it's next to this lakefront. The wives of these soldiers and these people that are literally going and burning people all day don't know what's happening. They're not aware. Like, their kids are not aware. They don't want them to know that this is happening and ongoing. So there's multiple ways of propagandizing. You could keep it a secret. You could lie about it. You could frame it in a way where people can't have a conversation. And it is something that is being done to this day, not only in Israel, Palestine, but in Ukraine and in the Uyghur. The Uyghur Muslims are being killed, Burma, all over Central Africa. This is a continuous event that's happening. This is the most televised of them all. It is, I think, it is a very hopeful situation in the sense that because there's so much attention on this, and because it's so relatable to a lot of people. There's almost 2 billion Muslims. The entire West knows about the plight of the Israelis and the Palestinians. This has the capacity to change the way people think about war, the way people think about also property and nation states. And I think I'm hopeful. I was not very hopeful a few months ago. And I'm really happy that, because I've been wanting to have this conversation with anybody who would talk about it on any side for almost 6 months, and I didn't have that opportunity, and I'm glad, because now I can think of it more logically and rationally, less with emotion. Have you watched Attack on Titan?
The anime?
Mm-hmm.
I've watched parts of it, not like in entirety. My wife watches it, and I watched it with her a couple of times, but I get the a general premise.
The last two seasons are a real kind of good conclusion as to how these things turn out.
Mm.
And the main problem that I see in kind of moving this forward in a way where both people can get something good out of it is that there's this finger pointing situation. So if you ask the Palestinians, both in West Bank and in Gaza, like, what do you guys, how do you guys want to handle this? Who's in the wrong, who's in the right? It always ends up being a finger pointing competition, right? Like they started this, and then you ask the Israelis, well, this was our homeland 3,000 years ago. And I guarantee you, if this continues in 3,000 years, that same piece of land will be invaded by the opposite group, and they will say, this was my historic piece of land. Same way that the Israelis now have a claim to it. The Muslims in 1,000, 2,000, 3,000 years will also have a claim to it. They'll say, this is my piece of land, and they'll fight over it. Because in order for any, like if you fight with a friend or with a family member, somebody needs to say sorry and actually work towards improving the relationship. And who's that someone? And now the problem with putting that responsibility on the Palestinians, despite this last event being started by them, despite the fact this has been going on for 7 years, the problem with putting that responsibility is they have no power. So with this equilibrium of power, like they can't change anything. They can apologize, and a lot of them have. A lot of them have condemned Hamas or voted for a different party, but there's no way that they can resolve this. And I think the responsibility on resolving this and being the first to like step up and take, take the hard position of saying sorry is going to be on Israel. And it's going to be on people within that country that have a feeling of humanity towards these people. And I think that that is going to be like the first step in fixing this. Now, how do we make that happen? How do we facilitate that? I don't know. And that's this frustrating part of this conversation is like, okay, we can talk about it, and people might hate us for doing so, but how do we move it forward?
Yeah.
What are your thoughts?
Yeah, I think there's this quote by Malcolm X that I think is like really relevant to the situation. I'll read it out. He said, "If you stick a knife in my back 9 inches and pull it out 6 inches, that's not progress. If you pull it all the way out, that's not progress. The progress comes from healing the wound that the blow made. They haven't begun to pull the knife out, and they won't even admit the knife is there." I think that's the crux of the issue. In terms of like the end game solution to this, yes, there needs to be reparations made for all the families that had family members killed and their homes destroyed. They need to rebuild everything that was destroyed. All that needs to be made whole, and the like, and that's just like step one to like get back onto like a level playing field. And after that, it's like generational healing of undoing the pain on both sides from as a Palestinian, having your whole lineage taken out in one day, being able to then go and live alongside a Jewish person, and it's for them, it's very hard to differentiate between the Israeli government and the IDF and the Jewish people. For them, it's like there's that group of people on that side of the wall and all of us here. And it's like trying to get a Holocaust survivor to try to empathize and be friends with a German person. Even though that German person might not be a Nazi and might not have done anything wrong, I think it's an unfair standard to put on that Holocaust survivor after whatever trauma they went through, the state of their mind, to be able to just be able to accept that right away without any kind of sign that this is not the same as it was before. And similarly from the Israeli side, they've lived with this propaganda their whole lives that these people are rapists and murderers and whatnot, and then being able to like if you grew up your whole life with that propaganda, it's not, and especially if you're an older person, you lose your neuroplasticity and all that. Like you're not going to be able to change your mind on that so easily. So that is, I think, like a very difficult barrier to cross, but it needs to happen. The tricky part is right now, like there was a recent poll in Israel, and 60% of Israelis said that the government is not using enough force in Gaza. So, that is again, it goes back to like the knife in the back thing of like, yes, we want to move towards healing and acceptance and this and that, but um, what they're talking about is sticking the knife in deeper, and that's something that's very difficult to contend with. And I don't think that anyone can expect Israel in its own accord to change that tune, in and of themselves, especially because the leadership is very kind of they're true kind of extremist, terrorist, psychopathic, murderers that are, sitting in the government right now. And so I think the moral onus on a lot of this is on the West, because they're the ones supplying Israel with all this. They're the ones kind of laundering their lies. If you look at, for example, that recent like New York Times report that got exposed, they made a report on how Hamas like weaponized sexual violence on October 7th. Turns out the person who wrote that, used to work for the IDF propaganda team, wasn't a journalist at all. All the entire report had no evidence whatsoever, but they got it published in New York Times, and then because it's in the New York Times, all of Western media, repeats it. Joe Biden on the State of Union address, saying Hamas weaponizing sexual violence, when all of that is literally like propaganda and lies. And there's a leaked report too by the IDF, like propaganda team, where they did like user studies on what gets people the most kind of worked up, and what gets people to like um gets people the most angry. And sexual violence or rape was like the number one thing that got most people angry, and that's why they're driving that point so hard in the propaganda. So uh in the if you look at the US, it's like, it's not even that, the Republicans are pro-Israel and like the Democrats are at least, siding with the Palestinians. It's like, the Republicans are like extreme pro-Israel. Democrats are like, mostly pro-Israel. So it's like there isn't even any room or space to acknowledge in that kind of situation that like Palestinians have a right, or some sort of cause. And even if you look at what so-called like moderates that talk about this, even they, it'll still come with all these things like, oh yeah, Hamas still needs to be destroyed and this and that. Like, and I agree in terms of any killing of civilians, any sort of, no matter who does it, it's wrong, and it's should not be acceptable. But the double moral standard is very, I think, apparent when I think this is the first. You were talking about how during the Holocaust, the wives of the officers didn't even know what was going on. If you contrast this to what's going on there, like you have all these IDF soldiers that are posting TikToks with their war crimes. This guy, for example, like posted on Twitter, like bragging about running over a Palestinian with a tank. And it's the first time I've seen like this level of genocide where it's like celebrated and talked about publicly by the group committing it. And there's countless examples. I linked some of them in Pete's podcast too, and there's a lot more of that. But this kind of dehumanization is like encouraged and celebrated. There's like the IDF running the kind of, what's it called? I forget. Like there's like a Telegram channel where they publish all the kind of brutal like gore and murder of Palestinians, and we're celebrating it. It was basically it got leaked that it was actually the IDF running that propaganda channel. It wasn't some just like extremist people or like bad apple within the IDF or something. So I think,
So,
yeah,
quickly, I agree with a lot of what you're saying. The days where, well, October 7th, October 8th, I've saw a lot of gore coming from the Palestinian side, and I've seen way more gore coming from the Israeli side,
yeah,
to things that are like unimaginable. To say that there has been no rape on either side is wrong. To say there's not been murder on either side is wrong. And I understand what you mean. I understand how people, this is a common trope. I mean, you hear about the black people are coming to rape your women. That was one of the Ku Klux Klan main, talking points to get people riled up and to join their organization. This happens right now against Indians, and you can see it on Twitter all the time. I see Twitter and I watch it like impartially, but I understand what you're saying, and I think you're right about a lot of things. And I understand what you mean about, the level of genocidal hatred that you see in people and how publicized it is. And I think that there's two things to consider here. So in Algeria, there was a civil war in the 90s that lasted until 2003. That's why my father left to the United States. About 200,000 people were murdered. And those times you can walk outside and you'll see someone's head on a lamppost because they want you to be afraid and they want to show you, they want you to feel terror. And that's how they win. That civil war was started for religious reasons. It was mostly political. But the point I'm trying to make is that those people, 10 years after the Civil War started, it needed to wrap up. It would never go one way or another. It needed to wrap up. So what the president did, and he was probably the most popular president of that country, is he said that if you just put your arms down, everything's forgiven. Rape, murder, hanging people, doesn't matter. All forgiven, all good. And at this point, 20 years later, I think Algeria is one of the countries with the least amount of terrorism that I've seen. Like very, very little amount of terrorism, really strong anti-terrorism intelligence agencies in that country. The reason I state this is even if Palestine and the West Bank and Gaza were to be completely eliminated and everybody were to die and the whole thing would have been flattened. What I think a lot of Israeli people and a lot of Americans are failing to understand is just because the governments of Arabic countries like Saudi Arabia and others are siding with Israel in terms of like the political game, the people in those countries are very not siding with Israel. They're very angry and they probably would go to war with them if they could. And I say that not as a threat, but mostly from my own perspective, from what I've seen, from the people I've spoken to, from my family. In order for the Jewish people to have a homeland that has peace, they need to be able to make peace themselves. And I think why I bring this back is that during these months of like anger and hatred and probably drugs, this was how the civil war in Algeria was fueled. It was all benzodiazepines to make people not upset at literally destroying people and ripping them apart. Drugs is a huge part of it, but soon that's not going to last forever. This hatred, the news, the drugs start is going to start decreasing, and people are going to start having to live with the consequences of their actions, just like US soldiers that go back to the United States after going to different countries have PTSD. Israeli civilians are going to have PTSD. Israeli families are going to have PTSD. Arabic families are going to have PTSD, and they're going to be able to reflect better on the actions that they've taken over the last year or so, or 7 years, we could say. What I hope that, and one thing that I want to extend out, and I will pass the mic back to you in a second, is if anybody listening here is Israeli or Jewish or has anything to say about this, I would really like to have you on and to discuss this in empathy, because I want to get both sides, and it's been really difficult for me to find somebody on that side who would be willing to have a conversation. Not like a finger pointing conversation. I interview, I just ask you questions and you share. I would love for that to happen. If you could somehow facilitate that, I would be super happy. But to pass the mic back to you, and what do you feel like we can do as people right now to make this better in the future?
Yeah. I want to just circle back on one thing specifically, just because it's something like really, affecting the current like narratives and people's perception of it. Is this claim of rape and sexual violence? If you look at so in the New York Times piece that they claimed that this happened. The actual victims that they named have been trying to speak out and say that no, this didn't happen. It's a lie. they were not sexually abused, but those people have been suppressed and censored from the media. So I think, and again, there's this report again that talked about like all the talking points that Israel gave to U.S. politicians in terms of like what things to talk about, what things not to talk about, which bothers you more. They did all these surveys, and it's a very kind of crafted and like to evoke a specific response from people narrative. And it's sad because there's enough bad things that happen on October 7th that you don't need to make things up and lie about it. But again, it's the goal was not to the goal is how can we make Palestinians look as bad as possible so we can justify erasing them and kicking them out of their land. And so there is still zero evidence that any of that happened. The people that said the people that it was claimed that this happened to, they came out and said it didn't happen to them. And so I think it doesn't help any situation to like kind of launder these like propaganda points, or say that they happened when they didn't happen. So
So
yeah.
1 second here, and yeah, first of all, thank you for sharing the sources. I would appreciate it if you send those to my Discord. The reason I took that step of um, it could have happened, right, is not because I believe that it did or that it didn't. It's because I think these are the kind of points that end up turning into these arguments where one person is pointing at the other saying, you don't believe me and you don't believe me, and it becomes an unproductive conversation. I really respect and appreciate your attention to detail in sharing all of this and collecting this data, which is why I referred back to Pete's podcast. It really is excellent, the depth that you went to. And I can definitely see this again from a propaganda perspective happening. I like to give the benefit of the doubt for anyone saying that they're a victim of something, because I find it unproductive to argue these points. It becomes more about, oh, you're not believing victims, and it goes down that path of, again, we lost that productive conversation. And I'm not saying that to you. I'm saying how I'm trying to present this in a public sphere. Does that make sense?
Yeah, definitely. And I think I agree with you in terms of like most situations, yes, you want to not like uh, blame the victim or say that they're lying and things like that. But I think there's a special case in terms of the Israeli narratives where, they've been proven, like documented hundreds of times, blatantly lying about so many things, manufacturing fake evidence, all these things. So I think it's slightly different with them when they make claims, especially when the victims themselves come out and say that it didn't happen. In this sense, yeah, I do agree we should believe the victims, and they're saying it didn't happen. So that's like and again, I think it's different when it's like you want to believe the victim in terms of one isolated incident that happened between certain people versus if believing the victim means that Israel uses that as justification to continue like murdering innocent Palestinians. I think those two are different things, because like I've gotten like a lot of people who see everything that's going on. The one justification, or like one of the justifications they give themselves, is that, yeah, but they raped all these people, and weaponizing like sexual violence, like that's not acceptable, and so like Israel's justified in doing that. And so it's very insidious, because these are very intelligent, kind of ruthless, like CIA and Mossad especially. They know exactly how people think. They know exactly what language to use to control and divert the narrative towards exactly what direction. And I think the number one most important thing in all of this should be the truth. And when it comes like science, for example, you can't make any scientific claim without providing evidence. And Israel is basically pretty much never provides evidence for any of their claims, and they're always accepted. especially in the West and Western media. They take Israel at their face value. If you look at, for example, the here, actually, you can see my screen, right? I'm just gonna quickly share
Israeli
this video.
officials
Can you hear this?
have told so many lies since October the 7th.
Okay, so yeah, Mahdi Hassan. Okay, so by the way, Mahdi Hassan, he was a MSNBC anchor, and the day after he was calling out the Israeli IDF representative, he was grilling him hard on all these things. The day after he was let go from MSNBC, and that kind of gives you another indication of even in like left-leaning liberal media in the West, it's very controlled in terms of who can say what, and if someone goes too far in criticizing Israel, they can be axed. But yeah, he goes over, for example, like
Israeli
the top 7 lies about Gaza, and most people actually would not even know that all these were lies. So I just wanted to like show this.
So many lies since October the 7th, with so little pushback from the media that it's hard to keep up. So here from Zateo is the first in a new segment we're calling Debunked. The top 7 lies about Gaza debunked. Lie number 1. There was already a ceasefire on October the 6th, and Hamas broke it. You see it said everywhere by Benjamin Netanyahu, by Hillary Clinton. They all say it, and yet it's completely false. Just 2 weeks before October the 7th, Israeli airstrikes hit Gaza for the 3rd day in a row. And on October the 4th, Gaza Strip protesters received bullet wounds to ankles, medics report. Does that sound like a ceasefire to you? Even over in the occupied West Bank, before Hamas's attack on October the 7th, Israeli forces had already killed a record 234 Palestinians. If there was a ceasefire in place before October the 7th, nobody told the Israeli military. Lie number 2. The priority is freeing the hostages. There's no higher priority, Joe Biden has said. And yet, last month, Israel's finance minister said bringing home the hostages is not the top priority. Hamas must be defeated, he said. Wittingly or unwittingly, the Israeli military has actually killed more Israeli hostages than its soldiers have rescued. In fact, as one Israeli journalist recently tweeted, citing new reporting from an Israeli news website, 10 hostages were killed by Israeli airstrikes in Gaza, some even as the Israeli military had intel they were residing in the buildings that were targeted. The IDF reportedly killed their own citizens and then lied and said they died in, quote, Hamas captivity. But sure, it's all about the hostages. Line number 3. 40 beheaded babies. How can we forget the most emotive and most offensive lie of this entire conflict? A lie that went viral and was repeated by the President of the United States, who falsely said he saw pictures of beheaded babies, even though there weren't any. Nor were their babies burned in ovens, as Israeli newspaper Haaretz proved in their investigation. They were all lies. In fact, according to data released by Israel's Social Security Agency, tragically there was one baby killed on October the 7th, 10-month-old Mila Cohen, may her memory be a blessing. But in the interest of facts, she was not beheaded. Now, one baby killed is one baby too many, a tragedy, a crime. But 40 beheaded babies is just a cynical, reckless, repulsive lie that was then used to justify the killing of hundreds of Palestinian babies. Lie number 4, there was a Hamas base underneath the Al-Shifa hospital. Remember this video from the Israeli military claiming Hamas's main headquarters were under the hospital? Wow, an underground lair straight out of a Bond movie. To this day, we have yet to see any evidence of such a headquarters under Al-Shifa. Sure, as the AP has reported, the Israelis found a pair of metal cots in a room fashioned from rusty white tile. They appear to be out of use. Meanwhile, the Washington Post said the underground rooms found by Israel showed no immediate evidence of military use by Hamas, and Israel has provided no hard evidence that Hamas was using the hospital as a command and control center. The Israeli military lied so that they could attack more hospitals under the same false pretext. Line number 5, you can't trust the Hamas health ministry. Remember what Israeli spokesman Mark Regev said to me on Peacock back in November? The Gaza Health Ministry says Israel has killed more than 11,000 people in Gaza, including
the Hamas controlled.
Let me finish my question.
No, but you can't say that. No, but you said you have to say the Hamas controlled.
You can say that. I don't have to say what you asked me to say. Why mention Hamas controlled every time? Because you can't trust the health ministry's numbers, right? Except the Israeli military does. The Israeli military has secretly found the Gaza Health Ministry's casualty figures to be reliable, and even those numbers for its own intelligence briefings. Oh, and the world's most famous medical journal, The Lancet, found no evidence of inflated mortality reporting from the Gaza Ministry of Health. Line number 6, there is no hunger in Gaza. That is an exact quote from an Israeli defense official. And it's a lie, obviously. Ask the parents of poor Mahmoud Fatou, the 2-month-old baby who starved to death recently in Gaza. According to the World Food Programme, 4 out of 5 of the hungriest people in the world right now are in Gaza. And line number 7, the Gazans getting killed today elected Hamas. They voted for them. Put aside for one moment the bin Ladenist logic that says if you vote a way I don't like, I get to kill you. It's just not true that Gazans elected Hamas. It's a lie. Half of the population of Gaza are kids under the age of 18. Most of them weren't even born when the last elections in Gaza took place nearly 2 decades ago. And even in those 2006 legislative elections, Hamas didn't win a majority of the votes cast in Gaza. So again and again, the Israeli government and its supporters in the West tell brazen, shameless lies about the war. And so again and again, we must call out those dangerous and deadly lies, even if others in our media won't.
Yeah, so, I just want to say one thing is like, the most important thing is like preservation of facts and truth and providing evidence. This is like a whole like crypto punk sort of philosophy too. Is like don't trust, verify. But anything Israel sells is trusted immediately by the West, and later it gets proven as a lie, but then there's never any consequences. Meanwhile, anything coming from Palestinians, even when it's like recognized by all these independent bodies that these numbers are trustworthy, it's always kind of presented as, oh yeah, these numbers are Hamas, like we don't know how if they're real or not, etc. So, I think the first and foremost comes the truth. Unless we put the truth first, there's no way we can resolve this. And if the truth was on the side of Israel and the Jews, even if I'm Muslim, I would be siding with them. But so if it's not about oh, this is my group and that's your group. No, it's like, what's the truth? What are the actual facts? What's the evidence? And go from there. And until we do that, it's just going to allow propaganda to seep through and affect us all.
There's two sides of this conversation, and one of them is the political science side. And you mentioned something about science is you have to verify, you have to provide evidence for claims that you're making. And I think that's a conversation that I would love to have in that side of things, and I would love to have that conversation with you. And I would love for us to do research not only on this specific case, but on other cases around the world that are similar. And the reason for that is I am trying my best to walk that fine line between empathy and also criticism. And I'm not doing that out of weakness. I'm doing that out of respect for the people that I have interacted with over the last 5 years that have really taken my life from one perspective and taken it to another. One of the mentors that I had that brought me into crypto is a Jewish man, and I owe him my career in a lot of ways. And the reason I'm taking it super, super slowly and I'm being super considerate is not out of weakness, but out of respect. I think that there is a violence that is necessitated by nation states in general. That violence is against both its own people and its neighbors and the whole world in general. And I want to have that conversation with you, and I want to do that research with you. So if you do have that time, let's try to figure it out and set it up, and we can bring this case up among maybe 2 or 3 others to try to be as impartial as possible. That's one thing. There's another thing that I want to mention on my side of things. There's this story called The One Who Walks Away from Amalus. So a lot of this material that you shared with Peeth, what you showed me right now, and a lot of the actual Wikipedia articles, the headlines, I have read a lot of this material, and I am very, very up to date with what's happening and what's been happening for at least the last 10 years. And this story, The One Who Walks Away from Amalus, is about this society that can only thrive if one of their children is locked away and tortured every day. So this whole society is living in heaven, and the only way that can happen is by torturing a single child. And the people know about this child, but they don't want to interact with it. They don't want to think about it. They don't want to see it. The majority of them choose to look away, because the reality is if you unlock this child and you free them, then you are sacrificing all of the thriving, all of the good that you have in your life. And I think this is, again, a great story about the nation state and how countries facilitate and need violence to survive. The solution, in my opinion, is really on a much grander scale than stopping one country or another from waging war and killing people. I think the story and the solution is to walk away from this and to recognize a system that we've had for the last few hundred years that is no longer capable of keeping up with the modern day life, and of the fact that people are global now. You and I were different ethnicities, we live in different countries, and we're still having a conversation. And these borders and these mindsets of we are X people and we deserve X land, whether that be the Arabs or the Jews or any other country in the world, is only going to beget violence and killing and suffering. So I really hope we can have that conversation. I think my solution and what I want to leave this with is these shared spaces of conversation. I would love to facilitate those. I'm going to say it just so that I make it clear, and I'm going to make it public as well. I'm going to donate a small amount of money to any organization that is going to facilitate conversations between these two groups of people. because I recognize how difficult this conversation is for a lot of people, including my own community, my parents' community. And my solution is those shared spaces and to be able to eventually walk away from the nation state. And I hope that happens sooner. Does that make sense?
Yeah, for sure. Yeah. I want to say in terms of like the kind of division between groups of people, I think the real division line that needs to be addressed in terms of like solving a lot of pretty much all the problems in the world is not like between one group of people or another in terms of like nationality or ethnicity or country or anything like that, but between like the elites and the masses. In every group, it's the elites that are really responsible or kind of the source or the seed of a lot of the bad stuff that happens, and the masses are kind of the victims of it, or are convinced through propaganda or whatever to side with whatever the elites narratives is. Just like the elites of Hamas are they're all corrupt, and pretty much all the elites in a lot of the Muslim countries are corrupt. Similarly, in the West, a lot more people are awakening to it in America now in terms of just how this whole like two-party system and like this illusion of democracy and choice, and not realizing that the government actually works for private corporations more than anyone else, and the powerful owners of these private corporations kind of get like a permanent presidential power, because you don't elect them, but yet they still have such a outsized influence on the world and what goes on. So I think that's like the dividing line that people need to focus their attention on, is like, what are the elites doing and how is that affecting the masses or the average person, and realizing that it's not about a Jew versus a Muslim, but like the Muslim elites and the Jewish elites versus the Muslim masses and the Jewish masses, because they're the ones who don't want the masses to unite, because then that exposes the elites and they lose their power and influence over the world. So I think that's a conversation that like needs to be had more too, and it's difficult and it's so easy to get lost in just like, again, pointing fingers and all that, and not realizing that look at your own leadership or the people that rule over you, and understand that a lot of the problem lies with them. The thing you said about the story of Amalas, you said that was what it was. It reminds me of this Rick and Morty episode, season 7, episode 4. I think it's in the latest season, called "That's a Morte," where Rick has this like amazingly delicious spaghetti, and like the whole family loves it, and it's like the best food they've ever eaten. And then they find out the spaghetti is like from this like other dimension where like after people die, their guts turn into spaghetti. So in order to produce the spaghetti, they have to be like like murdering people, or sorry, they have to, it's only actually when those people commit suicide that their guts turn into spaghetti. So in this other society, they have this whole mechanism of getting as many people as possible to kill themselves, just so they can supply spaghetti to this group in this world. And I think that's a lot of what America is, where Americans living in the comfort of their lives and all the kind of luxuries and privileges they have, but blissfully unaware of all of the oppression around the world that the U.S. has done in order to, enable that to happen for the U.S. And again, this is like the coordination failure problem, where it's a huge net negative on all of the world for like a little bit of a win for this group of people, and people are going to defect in that scenario. So again, the prisoner's dilemma, Moloch, coordination problems, all these things. But the solution to that is like the elites, or sorry, the masses uniting against the elites, and the internet and cryptocurrencies. That's like the core of this ethos, is like the elites' abuse of money, and fiat money specifically, and printing money, and all that. That was what created Bitcoin, as a way for people to have that self sovereignty and ownership of their own value and money to be uncorruptible. And similar with internet and information, where instead of only mainstream media, we have all these other sources of media and people able to have conversations. I think like sticking to that ethos is what will move us towards a better future.
I think a shared story or a shared idea that all of crypto benefits from is Johnny Nash's game theory and the idea that the sum is better than all of its parts. You can combine all of its parts and the sum is still greater than that, because as people, when we get together, there's some magic that happens that lets us produce more than we're capable of doing independently. And what I would love to see in the world and in this space specifically, because I feel like a lot of the people in this space are very easy to see the truth. I think a lot of them, they come from a position of questioning authority, questioning systems, and I think convincing them to look at things and to help is probably the easiest thing that we could do. It's going to be a huge challenge in general, but it's still the easiest path forward for growing a message, any message it is. MetaDreamer, I really appreciate you taking the time to do this. I know that these conversations are not easy. I'm very grateful to find somebody who, can take the time to do that research and to, step back and kind of join me, despite, how difficult it is. So, is there anything that you want to say or you want to mention before we wrap it up?
Yeah. Yeah, I just want to say appreciate you for having this conversation too and initiating it. It's hard a lot of the time because you don't necessarily want to be like going around like shoving it in people's faces. But it's almost a necessity because people won't, reach out of their own accord to want to have that conversation. So appreciate you for doing that. And, I'm hopeful that this can continue and we can like normalize talking about it. Because as long as there's a taboo about talking about it, it'll, allow it to continue and propagate further. And yeah, I think, I'm very like optimistic and hopeful for that future where there can be, alignment again between like Jews and Muslims and Christians, and, it'll be like a very like powerful force, I think, to live in that world. So, the any like Jewish person that's like listening to it and maybe wants to talk to me in private or anything, like feel free to reach out. I empathize with how difficult it is to, think that everything you were taught growing up was wrong, or be told that was wrong, and that can understand how that can like trigger defensive mechanisms in oneself, and create a lot of dissonance. But that's something we have to work through. And yes, having these conversations are difficult, but it's not as difficult as what the people in Palestine are suffering through. And like Aaron Bushnell, for example, where he like set himself on fire, again saying that that sacrifice isn't as much as what the Palestinians are going through. He's someone who really understood what that meant. So rest in peace to him as well for doing that. But we should all take heed to that and listen to that and understand like why he did something like that, and not let that be in vain. And it's every week that goes by, I see more and more that it's like normalized to talk about it. It didn't happen as fast as I would liked in terms of like people in the crypto space. I thought it'd be very clear to people here, just for the same reasons you said, that people are more anti-establishment and they can see the truth of things much quicker. But and so for that reason, I think the crypto space should be at the forefront of this conversation. But unfortunately, it's not. And for whatever variety of reasons, but I'm glad we're having these conversations here. And at the end of the day, it's still people in the crypto space that have been receptive and having these conversations in terms of Peace, and then you, and then hopefully more in the future as well.
Let's end this by saying rest in peace to the 28,000 Palestinians that have died since October 7th, and the 1,400 Israelis that have died since October 7th. And I just want to kind of put that into perspective. I'm a new parent, and I can't live if my kid dies. And I really, really empathize with all of the people that lost their children. I think it's extremely horrific that this is happening. So rest in peace to everybody, and thank you for being here. And hopefully we'll get to talk again soon. Specifically, I would really like to approach that conversation, the political science conversation around, how governments need to kill to keep going. All right. See you guys in the next one.